Please, to Jeremiah chapter 2. Jeremiah chapter 2. You were probably grateful that there was no reading assignment for this weekend. Are you aware of that? Okay, yeah. But I did ask you to read this passage in preparation. I'd actually forgotten that there was no reading assignment for tonight, and I thought, oh no, I forgot to get Gabriel the quiz again. And then Lisa looked at the syllabus and said, there's no reading assignment. So maybe you got a nap this afternoon. That's great. We're looking at social media, technology, and your kids here, and parenting for the Calgary Bible Institute. A lot of your handout is freebie stuff. I'm not going to cover it tonight, but I want to start here in Jeremiah chapter 2. Jeremiah chapter 2. So as the prophet Jeremiah, the weeping prophet, delivers God's message to Jerusalem in chapter 2. He talks about, in verse 2, how I remember the devotion, the hesed, the loving loyalty of your youth, how you were faithful to me when you were a young nation, following after me in the wilderness. Verse 3, you were holy to the Lord, you were set apart. He tells them, I protected you. I'm paraphrasing here. But then he gets to the problem. In verse 4, he says, hear the word of the Lord, O house of Jacob, all the families of the house of Israel. Thus says the Lord, what injustice did your fathers find in me, that they went far from me and walked after emptiness, hebel, vanity, and became empty. They didn't say, where's the Lord who brought us up? And then verse 13. It says, my people have committed two evils. First of all, they have forsaken me, the fountain of living waters. That's the first evil. The second evil, he says, they have hewn for themselves cisterns, broken cisterns, which can hold no water. So why was Israel empty? They were empty because they were pursuing emptiness. When you pursue idolatry, you end up with what idols can provide you, which is nothing of substance. It's emptiness. It's like cotton candy. You can eat a lot of cotton candy, but it doesn't do anything for you except maybe cost you $5 at the fair or the hockey game. Emptiness always leaves you empty. So when you're not close to God, you'll look for satisfaction elsewhere, because we as human beings, we're always looking for true joy. We're always pursuing joy. And for most people, this is idolatry. So if you ever hear somebody say, or you ever find yourself saying this, my life is so empty, what does that mean going on in the heart? It means they're pursuing emptiness. When you're left empty, that means you're pursuing emptiness. Emptiness is a sign of idolatry. And all of us get there at times for sure. And usually when people are empty, they spiral into despair and then sometimes even into depression. But idolatry is deceitful because when we become distant from God, we don't often recognize what has happened. After all, we still may be going to church. We may even be reading our Bibles ritualistically, but we don't know that we're empty. We often don't recognize it. So drop down to verse 13. Drop down to verse 13. He says, the two evils, they've forsaken me, turning away from God. And that's where the distance comes from. Does the distance come from God? Does God ever walk away from us as his children? No, God doesn't put the distance between us. It's sin always creating distance. Idolatry always creating distance. And I'm not primarily talking about feelings. I'm talking about the reality of this distance. And he says we've hewn out cisterns. Kids, do you know what a cistern is? You do? Cistern in, say, Israel. If your parents go with us to Israel here in the next year or two, if we can get a trip scheduled, you'll get to see a cistern or two. And some of them are huge. There's one down there, the Dead Sea by Qumran, where they discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls. And this thing is about the size of a swimming pool. It's massive. So cisterns, smaller or bigger, they were usually carved out of the rock, out of the limestone. And then as it rained and the water ran off, they would collect the extra water. It's kind of like a rain barrel in our day. Maybe your parents have one attached to your gutters. But it collects the rainwater, and then you could have a little bit of water during the dry season. Well, what's the problem with cisterns? They're not flowing, okay? They're not moving, so the water can get stagnant and stale and dirty. And there's another problem with cisterns, is they can crack and the water runs out. And so instead of having water for bathing or washing clothes, whatever you needed to do, now you don't have water. Instead you're left with mud. And so God compares the Israelites' idolatry and by extension our idolatry to leaving a spring, a nice waterfall, a beautiful source of water. I remember when I worked at the Wilds Christian Camp in North Carolina, when we would hike down to Lake Jocassee. On the way to Lake Jocassee, there was a spring right off the trail, and it was right at the source. It wasn't runoff. You could go right to the source, and you could put your mouth right there and just take a drink out of it, no problem, because it was fresh, pure water. And he says, you've left that fresh spring a picture of satisfaction. You've left this source of satisfying life in order to carve out a cistern for yourself, which is not as good as a spring. And he says, your cistern is broken. All the water's run out. There's nothing left. There's no source of satisfaction. So he says, in essence, idolatry is leaving God for what will never satisfy. Dr. Greg Mazak, Lisa and my counseling professor in school, he says there are two types of idolaters. First of all, those who are seeking, the seekers. And what are they looking for? They're looking for stuff. They're looking for positions. They're looking for respect, approval, pleasure. The seeker is constantly thinking that happiness is just around the corner, and they haven't come around the right corner, but once they get there, they're going to be happy, and once they find it. Well, we know that doesn't work, so that leads us to the second type of idolater, and those are the sad. Who are the sad? They're people who were formerly seekers, and now they've tried what they thought would bring them happiness, and it hasn't, and so they're empty, and now they're sad, because what they thought would satisfy has not. And so then what do people do? Usually they go back to the seeking cycle, and it just keeps going and going and going. You say, Pastor Michael, I'm not trying to be sarcastic here, but I thought we were talking about social media and technology tonight. What does Jeremiah 2 have to do with social media and technology? I think you can see where I'm going with this, is that a lot of people are empty on the inside, and it shows itself in their technology use. They don't have inner, lasting, real joy from a growing relationship with the Lord, and so they try and find it on TikTok, or they try and find it on video games or watching football. Let's talk about the dangers of technology. And boy, technology has changed in my lifetime. And some of you older folks in here might be able to even give better testimony than I can to what has changed during your lifetime. Not looking at anybody? Okay, I am looking at a couple. So when I was a kid, you know what our first video game system was, kids? Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, the first one we had was the Atari. And we didn't even get it new. It was used. And the graphics were fairly primitive, but they had some fun games. Warlords, Pac-Man, Pitfall. I mean, they had Space Invaders. You remember that? Very, very primitive. And then as I got into older elementary, maybe even middle school, one of my buddies, from a more well-to-do family got a Sega Genesis. And this was light years beyond an Atari, and it had the 2-on-2 basketball, I think Magic Johnson and Larry Bird, and it had Sonic the Hedgehog. I saw one of you kids reading a Sonic book this morning, and it was so far beyond. When we got our first Nintendo, I was probably 12 years old, and I remember that Christmas distinctly. Mom and Dad bought it used in the days before eBay or Kijiji, but they tracked it down probably through a classified ad in the newspaper, and I opened up the box, and there was a Nintendo, and it was used, but man, it was still something else. And you might remember when it wasn't working, you'd take it out and you'd bang it and you'd blow on it to try and get it working again. How about cell phones? Lisa and I got our first cell phone after we were married. I remember buying it from John Evans at a kiosk in the mall. John was a friend. And it was small. I mean, the first cell phones that came out, they were as big as like Army walkie-talkies, you know. But by this time, when we got one, it was small, and it had a little antenna that you could pull up out of it. Very, very primitive. Computers, we didn't even have a computer in my home till I was in college, and it was an old Mac. I mean, the thing was so slow on loading that if you were gonna look at the internet, it would take forever. But I remember when instant messaging was just coming out and how cool I thought it was to be able to instant message with Lisa when we were dating. Technology has changed a lot, but the human heart has not. The human heart is the same. There are some dangers of technology physically. Most people who put a lot of time into technology don't tend to sleep as well. I'm not going to go into the science of all that because I don't understand all that, but I know it's true. Obesity, posture issues, intellectual challenges because of excessive technology. We'll come back to that a little bit later. Spiritually, the desire to be in the know. This is an amazing stat I put in here for you. Just found this. 20% of people, this is from the University of Reno, Nevada. 20% of people who have at least one social media account feel like they have to check them at least once every hour, 3 hours to avoid feeling anxious. That is astounding. This phenomenon goes beyond FOMO, the fear of missing out. In fact, it has its own name, social media anxiety disorder. Wow. And I'm not making fun of anybody who struggles with that. It's just the state of where we're at. We tend to entertain ourselves. We play games while the world goes to hell. Misplaced treasures. This stat blew me away. Survey of 8,000 Christians. What percentage do you think said they check their phone in the morning before they read their Bible? 73%. First thing, going to our phones instead of God's Word. We have the influence of the so-called friends on social media and negativity. One of the aspects of social media that is detrimental is there's so much discouragement when you see friends that you thought would walk with the Lord forever not walking with the Lord. And we really don't need a lot more negativity in our lives, do we? Loneliness. Teenagers who spend over 5 hours a day on technology are 71% more likely, we're on page 2, 71% more likely to be at risk of suicidal factors. They obviously have the prideful display of yourself, how we're so prone to try and praise ourselves on social media instead of letting other people praise us, seeking acceptance and affirmation in all the wrong places, envy about the good but fake life of other people that we see on social media. So many things. Time wasting, addiction. 71% of Americans sleep next to their cell phone. Is it lower in Canada? Probably not. A lot of teenagers sleep with their cell phone under their pillows. Lack of spiritual discipline. We'll come back to that a little bit later. The average adult only has 2 hours of discretionary time in a day. So sometimes it's more than that. Sometimes it's less than that. We only have 2 hours of discretionary time, and then that's the time where you don't have to be doing something. There's a lot of stuff you could be doing on your to-do list, the laundry, all those sorts of things. But you got 2 hours of time in a day, and a lot of that is soaked up with nothing to show for it on a screen. There are benefits to technology for sure. It's not all bad. There are benefits. But I want to give you 3 questions. We're on page 3. 3 questions about technology to consider for yourself and for your kids. Because quite frankly, as we'll tie it up here, you and I as parents, we can't teach our kids anything about technology that we're not doing ourselves. So if I'm not an example in technology, and I got to say here, the Lord convicted me about this today, I've got to cut back on my phone time. But if we're not modeling for our kids, how can we tell them, imitate what I'm doing? We can't, with any credibility at least. So, questions about content. First question there, is this content detrimental to their spiritual maturation? So, we touched on this last week in adult Sunday school, but sometimes people think, should I only listen to spiritual music? Should I only read Christian books? And the answer is no. I mean, you should put the majority of your time into those things, but fiction and historical literature and humorous TV shows, they do have a place in the Christian's life. And so the question is not so much, is this helping me to grow in grace? Because, for instance, when I sit down with a family and watch, say, Andy Griffith, it's not helping me to grow in grace, right? I'm not learning valuable life lessons from Opie Taylor. I'm not. But I'm also not being pulled farther away from the Lord, okay? So I think it's okay to enjoy those things in select doses that are not pulling me further away from the Lord, but I'm not coming away thinking, boy, I was really edified by Barney Fife tonight. I'm watching Barney Fife for a laugh, okay? A clean laugh. But if it's detrimental to my spiritual growth, if it's helping me, if it's preventing me from growing in grace, as Peter says in 2 Peter 3:18, then the content outright rules it out. Okay, as we saw last week in Adult Sunday School, Philippians 4:8, the trio of biblical principles. Number 1, is it true? Number 2, is it good? Number 3, is it beautiful? That applies to all of our screen time. Third question, is it stunning the development of their critical thinking and reasoning skills? When Jesus was maturing there, we saw earlier in our course on parenting in Luke chapter 2, he grew in what? He grew in wisdom and stature and favor with God and man. So his brain grew, his body grew, and his social relationships grew. And at first, when we read wisdom there in Luke chapter 2, we think he's talking about biblical wisdom, and certainly Jesus grew in biblical wisdom. But that word, that Greek word, is actually used for Moses growing in the wisdom, the learning of whom? The Egyptians. So school is okay, kids. It's beneficial for you. I hate to tell you, you need to grow. But social media, technology often stunts the development of critical thinking and reasoning skills. So first of all, consider content. Second of all, consider your family's priorities. Is the amount of time that we're spending on this hindering our family from accomplishing what God wants us to accomplish as a family? Number 3, relationships. Is the time we're spending on this bringing our family closer together, or is it bringing our family further apart? So for instance, we have a Nintendo Switch. We had a Wii, and now we have a Nintendo Switch, and we went together. So Lisa and I contributed probably the bulk of it, but some of the kids contributed. I don't know that Madison contributed because she wasn't particularly interested, so we didn't make her do that. But one of the reasons we chose these types of video game systems is because they're things we can do together as a family. So for instance, in Family Fun Night, we don't do this most nights, but some nights we'll play a game together. Doesn't mean other video game systems are wrong. But as a family, we want something that during our family time actually allows us to have some interaction with each other rather than just holding up in corners of the house and doing our own thing for hours on end. Another question there in the relationships: is it hindering my child from learning to develop real friendships? Online friendships are a lot easier than real friendships because real friendships take a lot more work. So let's talk about time usage here, and then we'll get real practical here at the end. I've got the link here to the study. It's a fascinating study done by Common Sense Media. They're a nonprofit down in the States. Not Christian from what I know. But they did a study in 2021 of the amount of time that tweens, whom they classify as 8 to 12, and teenagers 13 to 18 were spending on various technologies. And get this, and I'm sure it was probably a little bit higher during COVID, and perhaps it's come down after COVID. I hope so, because it's scary. 8 to 12-year-olds in 2001 were spending an average of 5 hours and 33 minutes on screens for entertainment purposes. That's not for the week, that's every day. So that's pretty much almost every hour that they're home out of school. Ages 13 to 18, so teenagers, it's even worse. 8 hours and 39 minutes a day on average. On average. So basically a third of your life gone like that. So they wanted to find out what were the most popular screen time activities for 8 to 12-year-olds. 61% said online videos. So YouTube, TikTok, those sorts of things. Television, 48%. Video games, 47%. For teenagers, online videos, 62% were their favorite. Video games, 39%, and 34% social media. I was actually surprised that social media was so low, but these teenagers, I think, are feeling the weight of the pressure of social media, and many of them don't enjoy it. And you say, okay, that's just the worst of them. No, that's the average. And so I figured out, I looked at their chart, and those that are spending, teenagers that are spending 4 hours or more on screens for the purposes of entertainment. I'm not talking about for school or study, for entertainment purposes. 75% of teenagers are on 4 hours or more. Only 25% are less than 4 hours a day. And some of you kids are thinking, Pastor Michael, you better wind down before our parents take our TV and throw it out. Well, no. I want you to learn through this as well, kids, about what is important in life. So I mentioned briefly earlier about the danger of technology intellectually for our kids. When a kid is spending 8 hours on screens for entertainment, what are they not doing? Well, they're not spending meaningful time with their parents in conversation. 2, they're probably not studying a whole lot. And 3, what are they not doing? They're not exercising, usually. And number 4, they're not reading. They're not reading. The average teenager in America only spends 34 minutes a day reading for pleasure. So what does that include? That includes books, ebooks, online articles, blogs, newspapers, magazines, just 34 minutes a day. Okay, page 4, please. So this Common Sense Media study found that the sites that teenagers would not want to live without, first of all, YouTube, 32% said I would not want to live without YouTube. 20% Snapchat, 13% TikTok, 13% Instagram, Discord 6%, and Facebook 6%. So if you're like me and Facebook is your major social media, or Twitter was even 3%, if you're at Facebook or Twitter, then that shows how old you are, really, because it doesn't appeal to the new generation very much. But what effect does social media have on mental health? It's becoming increasingly clear that social media is leading to the increase in suicidal thoughts, particularly among teenage girls. Another study here found that 1 in 3 teenage girls in the U.S. had given serious thought to suicide. 1 out of every 3. And these are people's daughters. They're also indicating that social media is probably linked to the increasing anxiety and depression. So let's talk a little bit about video games. I'll try and give you some practical advice here. Friends, Lisa and I don't have everything figured out. You don't want to parent by the seat of your pants, but you do a lot of parenting on the fly. You know what I mean? It's not that you're clueless about what's going on because you have the Word of God guiding you, but you're encountering new situations and you think, oh, we hadn't thought through that before. We better think through that. Or you kind of get off track a little bit and you realize, wow, we're watching way too much TV. And so then you start to make some changes. It's constantly in flux, but what I want to do is point us to the target and say, you don't have to follow our family standards to get there, but you better be pointed at the right target. And here's how we have found some things to help us in that direction. All right, kids, are video games sinful? You say, is this a trick question, Pastor Michael? Okay. No, video games are not sinful. I want to reassure you with that. Though the content of many video games is sinful, but video games on the whole are not sinful. But are video games as beneficial as some other types of entertainment? And the short answer is no, they're not. Why? Because it's hard in video games to have meaningful relationships with other people. So a lot in the past, families would sit around and what would they do? Say back in the 40s or 50s, what would they do for entertainment? They'd gather around the radio and they'd listen to the radio. Then the TV, all these sorts of things. Not necessarily ideal, right? But a lot of it today is centered around video games. But they don't provide as many opportunities for meaningful interactions as a board game would. We were playing with, I think it was Simon and Julianne, can't remember who else was there, a game called Throw Burrito. It was a lot of fun. Some of you have played it. And it's not that we're having deep spiritual conversations during those times, but we're actually looking at somebody and interacting with them rather than staring at a screen. Sports, hiking, getting the family around, playing music, getting the instruments out and playing together. So, parents, a blank check for unlimited video game time is going to be abused by your kids. Maybe not all of them, because some of them have different interests. But boys in particular, the Common Sense media showed that teenage boys spend about an average of an hour and 14 minutes on screens than their female counterparts do. So that puts the boys up at 9 hours and 16 minutes a day. So boys are particularly vulnerable to this. So you don't have to follow our guidelines. I just give you a reference here for what we do, not because I think you need to do that, not because I found a Bible verse that says 75 minutes on Tuesday and 90 on Saturday. That is the path of godliness. Now, I don't know if you're reading the Apocrypha or what you're reading, but it's not where I found it. So I'm not giving these to you so you need to imitate those. But just to give you an idea of what we do, what we used to do with our kids, and it morphed throughout their lives, but we used to give them, was it an hour on the weekdays, an hour a day, and it was in the afternoon. But what we found with that is that everything started of the day, every part of the day started being oriented towards when are we going to get to do our screen time? When are we going to get to do our screen time? And it started dominating our day. I mean, we were trying to be limited and focused, but they were anticipating it so much that it ended up overshadowing everything else. And so Lisa and I finally reached the point where we've got to make a change on this, because this cannot keep dominating our kids' mindset. So what we did is we switched to two times a week. It's not always on Tuesday, but we try and do 75 minutes on Tuesday. Let them do 90 minutes on Saturday. Those aren't magic numbers, and there are extra times that they'll get. Sometimes we'll do it as a family after supper on occasion. Sometimes if Lisa and I are counseling somebody for an extended period of time, we'll give them a little extra time in the week. But the point is you're going to have to regulate it. You can't just say, well, whatever you want to do, kids, have fun, because it probably will end up an idol for them. When it comes to their devices, you should have access to those devices where they know that you know the password because they've given you the password, and you as the parent have the authority to check it anytime you want to see who they're communicating with or what they're looking at. Some practical suggestions about time limits. I want to encourage you, keep technology away from the table during meals. The family that talks together at meals is probably going to stay together. It's not guaranteed. It's a modern proverb that I made up. Okay, probably somebody said it before. It's not that memorable either. But it's a proverb. It means generally if families are spending meaningful time together, one of the ways to do that is around a meal. You realize most families never sit down as a whole family during a day and have a meal. It's remarkable. And I know there's some days where you can't. There's some times where I'm counseling over the supper hour. It happens, but you need to get meals together. And if the meals are going to be productive, you can't just every night, and I'm probably preaching to the choir here, but you can't take TV trays, and some of you kids don't even know what a TV tray is, but you can't take your TV tray and plop it down in front of the TV and just watch TV during the family meal. That defeats the purpose. Now, when I was growing up on Sunday night, sometimes we weren't wealthy. My mom and dad worked at a Christian university, and all our needs were met by God's grace. And mom and dad budgeted were very careful, and so all our needs were met. But we were never wealthy. We were probably lower middle class. But on Sunday night, we got a Little Caesars right across the street from our house, and so sometimes on Sunday night we get the treat of like a $5 Little Caesars pizza. You could pick up a couple of those, and we'd go home and we'd watch PBS, which was Channel 29, the public broadcasting system in the States. We'd watch Channel 29, and we'd watch Marty Stauffer's Wild America, show about different animals, and sometimes we'd watch the show Nova, which was another nature show. And we were so sheltered, that was like a highlight of our week. I mean, Little Caesars pizza and PBS, right? Simple pleasures. We don't have to entertain our kids to death. And then mom would usually make a homemade milkshake on Sunday nights, and that probably was the cap to a wonderful night, those old homemade milkshakes. Can I encourage you to limit screen time when you're traveling with your kids? Now, if we're going on a long trip, we'll have limited screen time in the car. But when you're driving your kids across Calgary, and I'm not preaching to anybody here, I don't know who I'm talking to, I'm just giving general principles. But your children don't need a screen in front of them for a 30-minute drive. If they do, then that means you probably trained them to need that by giving it to them. Again, that's not a sinful right and wrong thing, just a tip. That's a good time for family camaraderie or listening to something, because listening engages the mind, because they're having to process and think critically as they hear something rather than just staring blindly at a screen. So isn't it amazing that here in Alberta we have some of the most beautiful scenery in all of the world, and a lot of kids are missing it because they're staring at a screen as mom and dad are driving by at 90 kilometers an hour, and they're missing out on the majesty of God's world. Another practical tip, keep screens out of the bedroom. Keep screens out of the bedroom. You're just setting your child up for self-destruction. If you do have a screen in the bedroom, you certainly don't let them use it overnight. It's got to be out of the room overnight. On other rooms in the house, keep doors open. So for instance, Blake does school in his room, online school. And so our requirement is that his door is always open when he's on a device, and his screen is facing towards the door, so that when we're walking past, we can always see what's on his screen. You might tell everybody you got to put your phone on the fridge at night. I want to talk a little bit about pornography very discreetly. You need to have some sort of internet filter on all of your devices. Covenant Eyes, it's not foolproof, but it's a good place to start. You need to have a filter on all of your devices, I would recommend. But even when you have a filter, because you can circumvent it and you can find ways, I'm personally, and I'm probably in a minority position here in North America, but I personally wouldn't recommend you let your teenagers have a smartphone. It's not a sin issue, it's not a right and wrong issue, but I think there is some practical wisdom in not letting them have a smartphone. Now, somebody might push back and say, well, I'd rather have them learn how to use a smartphone when they're in my home so that I can teach them. Okay, I'm fine with that. I'm okay with that. But if you take that approach, I would recommend waiting at least till their grade 11, grade 12 year. It's like putting it'd be like me getting in the ring with a heavyweight. All right? You know what I'm talking about. I don't watch boxing, so I'm not promoting boxing. It's just an analogy. But if I got in a ring in a heavyweight, you know what would happen? I might not come out alive again. I've got to get toasted. Now I am a little heavier than I was when I got married, which was about 175 pounds. But you put a kid in the ring with a heavyweight, the heavyweight being their smartphone, they're going to get beat up. They're going to get beat up. And maybe you have 1 out of 10 that does okay, but I'm concerned. In spite of all your precautions, your kids will probably at some point run across pornography. It's just the world that we live in. So if that becomes a reality in your home, then I would encourage you, don't blast your kids. Shepherd them through it. We wish it wasn't a part of the world that we live in, but it is a part of the world that we live in. So practically, you're going to need to remove their easy access to it. So you might have the regulation. If you do give your kids a smartphone, and again, I'm not recommending that, but if you do give the kids a smartphone, that if you access pornography on the smartphone, it's going to be taken away. It's going to be taken away. Make it hard for them to sin, but spiritually help them to know how to say no to sin and yes to God. I have a handout on walking in purity. It's about 35 pages. If you would like that, I'd be happy to email that to you if you want that. I give you some suggestions here on how to use social media wisely, and I'm not going to cover that with you tonight, but I'll leave that for your perusal. On to page 6, please. On to page 6. Just a few questions for you that I've adapted from Tony Reinke's book, 12 Ways Your Phone is Changing You. 4 questions about your social media posts, and I know this is probably more for parents, but if your kids, if you decide to let them have social media and you want to think through that, I'm not saying you should or you shouldn't necessarily, but there are significant dangers of social media. But a few questions of application for them to consider and for you to consider as a parent. Do my posts give the right opinion of God and His glory? Do my posts edify believers or speak grace to the lost? Does my technology have me enslaved? In other words, do I use it or am I mastered by it? Is it a tool or am I mastered by it? Does my technology pull me towards God or further away from Him? One of the things I didn't mention last time when we were talking about parenting teenagers But during those teen years, your teenagers need to be learning what it is to serve other people. Your kids are used to being served. Why? Because when they were born, if you didn't serve them, they were going to die. You had to do everything for them. You had to feed them, you had to change them, you had to bathe them, and very rightly so. That's your responsibility as a parent. But a lot of times, unfortunately, even in some Christian homes, that mindset continues on out of the toddler years because mom and dad just keep putting their desires first and basically letting the kids decide what happens in the home. But as they learn servanthood, they're learning to focus on others. And part of that in our world is learning to say no to technology for love for God and love for your fellow man. So right off, let me challenge you parents, don't start your day on your phone. Now you may have to see if you got called into work, okay? But don't get into checking out who won the hockey game. Don't get into checking out who posted what on social media. Don't watch the latest video. Open your Bible and spend time with God. Amen. Start your day with God. So model for your kids what it looks like to say no to technology in order to love God and then love your fellow man. So just a practical tip. Again, it's not a sinful thing. Some of the stuff I'm sharing with you tonight is not a biblical right or wrong. They're just practical tips, and you take them if they're helpful and apply them to your situation. But for instance, when I'm out with somebody, and this might frustrate you when you're trying to get a hold of me, but most of the time during the day, my phone is on top of the fridge, right? If I answered every call that came in or every text message or every email, I would never have any time to study. I would not be successful as a pastor because I would be so distracted. So sometimes you have to limit your access. But when I'm out with somebody, say having coffee, what I'll try and do is I'll try and put my phone on the table because I don't like to sit on stuff or have it in my pockets, but I'll often put it on the table and put it face down. What does that communicate to the person that you're with? I'm all in. I'm not distracted here. If it rings, if it's on vibrate, and if I hear it rings, sometimes I'll say, okay, excuse me, I just got to check to see if this is my wife. Because I will answer a call from my wife or one of my kids, but I won't answer a call from anybody else. Why? Because I want to be focused in on that person. So show love to God by limiting your screen usage. And screens can be a huge deterrent to learning servanthood. One of the reasons we don't have a lot of servants today is because they're used to serving themselves on screens. Another reason we don't have a lot of servants today is because mom and dad haven't modeled it for them. So the last paragraph there on page 6, self-discipline. Technology is good in moderation. That's the key. Technology is helpful in moderation. It can be a wonderful tool. It can be enjoyable. It can be a benefit to your family in moderation. And if your kids are born again, if they come to know the Lord, then they can learn self-discipline because of the Holy Spirit who indwells them, producing that fruit of the Spirit, which is what? The last fruit of the Spirit is self-control. It really comes down to spiritual discipline, and something that I'm still striving to grow in as a believer. But if your kids are going to learn self-discipline with their technology, what is the prerequisite? That you as a parent are disciplined with your technology. So think about it. Do I want my kids, when they're grown and they think back about our home and think about, oh yeah, mom was so fun. She made our home such a happy place. And dad, he was okay when he wasn't looking at his phone, when I could get his attention, or when he wasn't watching the football game. If I'm consistently distracted by screens, how can I teach my kids to be balanced in their use of technology? I must discipline myself first so that I can say what Paul said, imitate me. Why? Because what I'm doing is imitating Christ. All right. Thank you for joining us online.